So welcome to our talk today, the environmental impacts of renewables. We have 4 speakers today. One person, Sybelle Foxcroft, is coming in through Zoom because she's up in northern Queensland. And Grant Piper and his wife have come out from around Orange area, isn't it? It's hours west, Coolah. So just to speak to us here. We're going to focus on the effects of renewable infrastructure and the effects on the environment, the animals and farmland. So we at CVA, Community Voice Australia, we give space for marginalised, non-mainstream discussions because we believe it allows for a more robust public debate. And therefore I ask people to be curious in questions for the special guest speakers today and use today to learn more about the issue, perhaps from a perspective you haven't considered before. Community Voice Australia has been formed to advocate for transparency and accountability from all levels of government and associated bodies. We support initiatives that protect and enhance the environment, the well-being and quality of our community and country. So our focus is to strive to inform public debate on key issues. We listen to voices from a wide perspective with a focus on those who are marginalised. We stand against division. We seek perspectives from across the political divide. We focus on issues and not party politics. We want to get to the truth, and we believe people have the right to claim understanding based on their own personal knowledge, and that those voices are really important. So the 4 speakers are giving their time to raise the concerns, and I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Michael Feneley. Michael Feneley is a Central Coast resident, cardiologist and research scientist. He is one of the founders of the Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute. He has published and spoken against the floating offshore wind turbine developments proposed for the Central Coast and the Illawarra, arguing that these projects are not feasible anywhere in New South Wales with current technology. Michael will outline how non-partisan, local community resistance in Norah Head saved the Central Coast from offshore wind projects and how the Hunter and Illawarra offshore wind projects can also be stopped. So thank you, Michael.
So I thought I should just, by way of introduction, you deserve to know, I guess, who I am. So you've heard what I do professionally, but in full disclosure, I should say that, my talk's largely about taking a non-partisan approach and trying to take the politics out of community action. But I can't do that and be honest with you without saying that I have run as a candidate for the Liberal Party previously, so you should take that into account if that you think that's an unreasonable bias in anything that I'm not in camera, in anything that I say. So look, a few years ago, my job, I run a very big heart department at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. But a few years ago, my family and I, these are my 2 younger children, we, in 2021, we bought a house at Noraville, and like a lot of Central Coast people, about a quarter of the working population up here, I either have to commute to and from Sydney or I base myself a few days in Sydney, whatever I need to do to make my job work while I do these other things. But look, this is our place at Noraville. We're very lucky. We have a home very close to the beach at Noraville, which you can see is a lovely part of the world. And this is the view that we have just down, almost directly in front of our house when we stand on the beach. This is what we see. And early last year, I was very surprised because I'm very busy in my job. And because my job's in Sydney, I have my mail delivered to Sydney. And therefore, I didn't get any notification at all about what was about to happen to us on the Central Coast. And in fact, most people in my area, Norah Head, Noraville area, where it was all going to happen, the only way they found out was through a free paper that was thrown over their fence, and the advice from government was rolled up inside. There was no public proper notification process. But this is what we found out was planned, So the plan was that they were going to allow more than 200 turbines at a distance, a minimum distance of 10 kilometres off the beach at Nora Head and Noraville. I'm pleased to say that due to very aggressive community action, which all occurred in the last 2 weeks of the notification period, that part of this program has been stopped. And I don't want to take any personal credit for that. It was a completely non-partisan, grassroots community campaign, and I, to be honest with you, with my job, I only came in at the tail end of it, so don't thank me. But what I would point out is that people down here on the southern part of the Central Coast, had they been this close, you would have been able to see them. That small little blip in front of them there on their headland, that is the lighthouse at Nora Head. So these things are very large. So to give you an idea, the original program they were going to put there was a 350 metre tall, 210 objects of this size, and you can see comparable to the Eiffel Tower. So if you imagine someone put 210 of those 10 kilometres from your home, and you've got to understand that the horizon, people say, look, offshore wind shouldn't trouble you because it's over the horizon. Well, the platform might be over the horizon, but if it's 350 metres high, you'll see it very well. And you can still see it out to 40 kilometres. You can see these, the tips of these will be seen at 40 kilometres. So fortunately, and this is just to give you some idea of scale, someone standing on the top of one of these, how big they are. So this was the original project, was to put these, so you can see here on the right, this is what they were originally going to do with the tail. This is actually the Hunter turbine field, and you can see that tail, this pointer isn't working, but the tail down the bottom, sorry, go back. The tail down the bottom that swept in, this tail is pointing directly at our house and all the people in Nora Head. So this was a highly alarming thing that happened to us. I'm pleased to say that as a result of very concerted and completely non-partisan community action, everyone got involved. We got them to chop the tail off. And we got them to make a rule that the minimum distance all around Australia now is 20 kilometres, and also that they couldn't be anywhere down. And we were very lucky where we were because we had so many people in the community with different interests. One of the things that saved us was we had the Nora Head Surf Club, right? Because everybody can be a NIMBY if they put something big enough outside your window, right? But we had this fantastic thing, the Nora Head Surf Club is a fantastic community, and they're one of the 5 or 6 national heritage surf areas in Australia, and they were able to use that. So that was very helpful. But we also had help from people who were worried about completely different things. So we were able to get, this is actually one of our demonstrations of the Illawarra, but this is concerted community action. You get the whole community out. It doesn't matter what their interests are or what their political background is. You just convince everybody that there's something in it for them. Now, this was a very cute thing that the Nora Head Surf Club organised, which was to have all of their people come down to the beach and form a whale, and so to make the whale point of view. And the whales, I'm not going to talk about whales today because everybody does, and I want to talk more about the engineering, but no doubt the whales are an important part of this argument. But everybody has their favourite animal, right? So a lot of people are worried about the whales. Some people were worried about the seahorses. A lot of people were worried about the large birds that fly off the coast, like this petrel. And the little green guy down the bottom is the swift parrot. And the swift parrot has important landing and nesting zones. So everybody had an interest. So we had people from the Greens, we had people who were traditional Labor voters, we had people who were Liberals, we had people who weren't voters at all, but everyone had a local community interest, good reason for being there. But call me different, but I thought my bird looks at things differently, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time not talking about those things because everybody does. And I really want to talk about a bigger question, and I think a more powerful question, and that is what the government wants to do with offshore wind feasible? Can it actually be done? Can it be done in a reasonable period of time? will it be effective and what will it cost? I think that if we go after these bigger issues, we can actually stop this sort of development. Certainly, we can stop it in New South Wales completely, I believe, but only if we go after these fundamental issues. So the first thing you need to know is there's a difference. There are two different flavours, two different types of offshore wind. The one at the top, these are fixed turbines. These represent 98.99 recurring of all the wind turbines offshore in the world are this type. It's straightforward. You mightn't like them, but they can be done. The engineering's pretty mature. You just stick the thing in the seabed, right? The biggest problem is they don't work if the sea floor is more than 60 metres below the surface. That's great if you're in the UK. Off the UK, they have a very shallow sea floor. That's why the UK has so many of them. But New South Wales doesn't have any seabed anywhere, and I do mean nowhere, that's less than 60 metres. We have one of the deepest offshore sea floors you can get. And that means you can't put a turbine anywhere off New South Wales beach that doesn't float. They all have to float. And that's an important thing because the floating, if at a greater depth of 6, this is completely experimental technology. No one quite knows how to do it yet. There's huge arguments about how to do it. At the moment, there are 50 different floating turbine research projects in the world, all competing with one another for dominance. But the likely horizon for commercially available floating turbines is probably at least 15 to 20 years away, if at all. And it still may turn out not to be commercially viable. So that's a big difference. They're also very complex. If you think that this thing is, say, 260 metres high on the surface, look at the depth that you've got to put all this gear underneath it to make it work. It's much more complex technology. The UK government just released a price that it's at least 2.4 times the cost of a fixed turbine to put a floating turbine in because of all the subsurface engineering. So that's the first thing you've got to know. The next thing you need to know is that there are 6 sites around Australia where the government has announced it wants to do this. Gippsland, this one, is the only one so far that's been announced where you can actually use the fixed turbine technology. New South Wales, they've announced our very nicely reduced, thanks to us, our reduced upper Central Coast one and a big one off the Illawarra. Now, I grew up in the Illawarra, so I can't take a trick. Our family home's still in the Illawarra and they're doing it there, and I bought a house up here and they're doing it here. So, you know, I have vested interests in both areas. But the point that I really want to get home today is that New South Wales is a completely unfixed problem and therefore I think experimental. I'll talk a little bit about some of the other areas later. So to do this quickly now, I wanted to say, well, when you say experimental, how experimental? Well, the biggest floating wind turbine farm in the world was opened in August last year, just off the coast of Portugal. And it has 11 turbines. Those 11 turbines took 5 years to put there, and they're not commercial. They don't supply any power to customers. They only supply power to an oil rig. They had terrible trouble getting the work done, and they end up having to be supported by so they're off Norway, and they end up getting government support from the Norwegian government. So how many floating turbines are scheduled to be off New South Wales? More than 600. So for us to be saying we're going to do a project like this by 2030 is just ridiculous. If it's taken them this long to do an experimental field of 11, it's undoable. The US government has given up on the idea that there's commercial viability in floating turbines. They're only allowing fixed turbines so far. They do want to do floating turbines because it increases the area, but they think it's such an experimental program that by analogy to the moon program, which was called the Moonshot, they're calling the research program the Windshot. So they don't regard this as a commercial proposition yet. So this is the complexity of it. You have to have each of these guys, each one of these rigs weighs over 10,000 tonne, each one. And there are going to be more than 600 of them. They have to be anchored to the sea floor at variable depths, largely by steel chain. The steel chain is very expensive. Each steel chain weighs about 400 tonnes on average. The longer ones a lot more. You need about 6 of those steel chains per rig. So it's a big thing, and then you end up with this. An array of these things that have all got to be no closer than 1 kilometre to each other, right? So this is only 47 of them. Otherwise they crash into one another, which is not good in a high sea. So they're typically 1 to 1.5 kilometres apart. So you can imagine how much chain we're starting to generate now. So here's the scale of it. Here's the chain, here's the person. That's one link in the chain. So to make one of these rigs float and do it properly and not crash into another rig, you have to spend a hell of a lot of money just on chain. It turns out that you need how much chain? Well, we know how much because the research project's been done. To float 20 of these offshore wind turbines, you need the entire steel chain production of the world in 1 year. What? The entire steel chain production of the world for 1 year. So to do the plan more than 600, you need more than 30 years' supply of the world's steel chain production. Or you have to say it's undoable until we find out some alternative to steel chain. But what you can't do is say, oh, we're going to do it and hope some steel chain turns up. The steel chain didn't turn up in Norway. That's why it took them 5 years to build 11 turbines, amongst other things. So feasibility is everything. So my message, I said I wouldn't have a political message, and I don't want to have one, and I don't want to mention any party political matter, but there is a minister for all of this, and his name's Chris Bowen. And so I like to say it's time we tell Captain Bowen his plan won't float, he's dreaming, and offshore wind for New South Wales should be abandoned because we can't do it in the time scale he's advertising to us. And if it fails, taxpayers are going to pay for it. There's no doubt. If it fails, if they try it and it doesn't work, we'll, in one way or another, we'll have to pick up the bill. So I think they should abandon New South Wales. Gippsland will work, but I'll tell you about Gippsland in a second. So the other problem is, and I've only told you about the steel chain, I haven't even spoken about the motors. I mean, the motors and the blades. There's lots of problems, but I'm not going to spend all afternoon here. But just to give you this, that's one of the 6 gravity anchor blocks you need to hold on to one of those. So for each chain, you need an anchor block. That thing weighs, well, you can guess how much it weighs. Can you see the scale of the person that's underneath that block of concrete just there? So, you know, this is a huge production. This is just for one turbine. And we're going to do more than 600. That's just in New South Wales. So, now if you are a whale, obviously all of these cables running along the coast are not very favourable to navigate if you're a whale, right? And when Chris Bowen was asked about this, he says, whales are pretty smart. They'll navigate their way around it. Well, good luck. But the idea that there won't be entrapment of whales and other wildlife, I think is very silly. By the way, no one's ever tried this where whales are. All the places that floating turbines have been put that don't have any whale migration zones in them. Now, this is not the only problem. So let me finish with some of the other problems that aren't specific. The biggest problem happened last year when the South Australian Labor government, that you would think would be trying to be friendly to the federal government, said, we don't want any of your wind turbines off South Australia at all. None. Big problem. Because Bowen's plan for the Great Southern Ocean wind thing was half of it was under South Australia. And South Australia said no for several reasons. The first reason they said no is that they have a very, very valuable rock lobster industry, which would have been destroyed on environmental grounds. The other reason was that even though they were using all this area of South Australia to generate power, all the power was going to Victoria. So they said, we don't want it for that reason either. And then they thought, well, we can still do it off Portland because Portland's got the Portland smelter. But then Alinta found out that they couldn't go to 10 kilometres anymore because of our action up here. We'd made them say you couldn't be closer than 20. Well, at 20, you haven't got 60 metres depth. And then Alinta said, well, we've done the whole design based on fixed technology. And then Alinta came out with this fantastic comment, which I loved, which is that we don't think that floating offshore wind's economically viable, so we're rescinding the contract. So Alinta walked away. The result of all of this is that, and this has only been announced last week, they announced that this field has now been reduced to this little guy. This is 1/5 of that plan. So there's a lot of shrinkage going on in these plans around Australia. At the moment, the only viable one is Gippsland because it's fixed. But Gippsland's in big trouble. Gippsland's big in trouble because a different government minister, Tanya Plibersek, who's the Minister for the Environment, said, you can't use the Port of Hastings to use the assembly plant because you'll have to dredge the Port of Hastings and you'll destroy all the Ramsar wetlands. So they've now had an embargo. They cannot, so that this plant, this is just an artist drawing, this plant was to build the Gippsland field, assemble it and float it out and put it in. So now they don't have anywhere to float from until they find another location. So now even Gippsland's off the table. So at the moment, there are no viable offshore wind developments available. I think Gippsland will eventually happen, by the way, because it's doable, but it's going to cost them a lot of money. So I'll finish on this. Internationally, how's it going? Really badly, really badly. Ørsted is the biggest developer of wind farms in the world. They're a big Danish energy consortium. They've just abandoned doing 2 projects off the east coast of the United States because at the price they were being offered, it was not economically viable for them to do it. And guess what? These aren't floating. These are fixed. So they've abandoned 2 fixed projects. And then last week, that happened in November. Then last week they announced that Ørsted announced they're downscaling their offshore wind projects to less than 50% of their projected development. So their share price has just gone into the toilet. And this is with technology that actually works, right? And then the other big story last year was that Siemens Gamesa doesn't put in the wind farms, Ørsted does that. Siemens Gamesa makes the turbine motors. And they've run into huge problems with the turbine motors, and they're the biggest producer of the turbine motors. Vestas and Siemens pretty much have the whole market except for the Chinese. So they've run into such a problem, they lost, just last year, they lost $7.5 billion US just on this wind turbine division. And it was such a threat to the parent Siemens company, they've hived off their wind division so that if it fails, the parent company won't fall over. So these are all the manufacturers of the motors are in trouble. I won't talk about the blades, it would take too long. So this is my end slide, because you're probably worried about time. My last slide is, what about the cost? Even if we could overcome all the engineering, what is the cost? The cost is completely disguised in the plans the government has released. The cost of offshore wind, the latest cost, this has just been announced. The latest cost for fixed offshore wind is US $150 per megawatt hour. It was only announced a few days ago, right? The UK government's latest cost for floating offshore wind has also just been announced. It's 2.5 times the fixed cost. So you can extrapolate on that. Some of you will know, because there's been this big argument, is nuclear silly for Australia? Well, it might be if you want it done in 10 years, because we have to change the law and we have to order the stuff and we have to plan. So I don't have any problem with someone that says we can't do it in 10 years. Well, we probably can't, even if you ordered it tomorrow. But the difference is this. There's a very good SMR, small modular reactor project that was about to go, it was a commercial project that was about to be done in Idaho in the US. And what's happened is the customers, who are local councils who need energy, have walked away because the price went from the previous $55 per megawatt hour to $89 per megawatt hour, and they're mainly using fossil fuels, which come in cheaper than this. So that's the comparison. That's a US price, this is a US price, that price is about double. So, and then you've got to have floating. Floating's 2.5 times that. So even if you allow for a government subsidy in the US of $30 per megawatt hour, so that the true price of this small modular reactor was 119 per megawatt hour, SMR still comes in cheaper than fixed offshore wind in the US, and it's vastly cheaper than floating offshore. So when Minister Bowen keeps saying publicly, as he did last Sunday morning on Insiders, that this is crazy, everyone's gone nuts about nuclear because it is not affordable and can't be delivered, here's the reality. The reality is that it's going to be a lot less affordable, and particularly in New South Wales. So in summary, New South Wales is the worst place in the world to want to do floating offshore wind. We can only do floating offshore wind, therefore we shouldn't do it, at least in the next 20 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. That was really informative. Thank you very much. So we're next going to hear from Sybelle Foxcroft. So she's going to join us over Zoom. And Sybelle has degrees in wilderness, reserves and wildlife, and a postgraduate master's degree certificate in environmental management with wildlife biology specialisations. In 2015, Sybelle earned a nomination for Australian of the Year, recognising her international conservation and wildlife efforts showcased in media outlets such as ABC, Foreign Correspondents and SBS Dateline. Adding to her remarkable achievements, Sybelle is a retired Australian Army Medical Sergeant veteran with over 20 years of service. She's currently working pro bono in the fields of environment and wildlife. Sybelle collaborates with scientific professionals in geology, hydrology, ecology and various science fields. Together, they are compiling an extensive report on the Western Mackay Pioneer Burdekin pumped hydro dam proposal, touted as the biggest pumped hydro project in the world. This project has exposed a series of failures by the state and Commonwealth environmental departments, which appear to be expediting approvals for renewable projects without due regard for the laws and legislation safeguarding land and ecosystems nationwide. As Sybelle's research progressed, she uncovered environmental shortcuts, improper procedures and incomprehensible decisions leading to the destruction of critical and core habitats across Australia. And although these projects had been in planning for years, on September 27, 2022, rural and regional communities woke up to the devastating news that their homes, protected environments and wildlife would be sacrificed for multiple renewable energy projects. These projects would transform a world-renowned, pristine, ecological gem into a catastrophic wasteland, leaving the affected communities in a state of horrifying devastation. Sybelle recognises the importance of uniting communities, fighting against individual renewable energy projects. She sees this collective effort as a powerful force capable of standing up against the fast-track transition to reckless renewables in Australia, a transition that bypasses and ignores all environmental laws and legislation. So we'll go over to Sybelle now. Thank you, Sybelle.
And hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I haven't got a fancy presentation for you. I've just come back from in my line of work with the doing environment and wildlife. I'm on the ground all the time, up on in the Youngla area, which is in the central Queensland area in Western Mackay, about 80 kilometres inland. And so you'll have to forgive me. I'm just going to be talking with you today and supplying you with some information that you may not have known before, and what is extremely important to in regard to these proposed renewable energy. monstrosities. And I say monstrosities because, as you have just heard, the wind farms, or I won't say farms because farm doesn't really suit that. It's the wind project, I'm going to call it. And those monstrosities of what, 1/4 kilometre high, and then you've got your blades. And I don't know if many of you have seen some of the video that's come out today of multiple turbines flying off, burning up into the bush, and basically causing havoc with the wildlife, as well as costing a fortune. And these wind farms, wind projects, these actual turbines don't last for very long at all. While you might hear politicians saying they're going to last for 10 years, 15 years, they have been breaking at a rate of about 2 years to 5 years in other countries. And this is a real issue. And I just was listening in regard to the offshore wind farms down there. And I just wanted to let you know about the whales. The problem with our government for many, many years is that the environment and the wildlife doesn't even rate as a priority when it comes to infrastructure. And for many years, they've done no surveys. They have no idea really how many koalas are in Australia, how many, platypus, how many echidnas, how many of anything. And that is because Australian environment and wildlife does not seem to matter to politicians, or they do not understand it enough to actually, implement the correct procedures. And I want to talk about that soon, but I just want to tell you about the whales. Now, whales can hear up to 10,000 kilometres away. And I did hear a politician stating that the offshore wind projects are not going to harm the whales at all. Now, this is a lie. And I'll explain to you, because their hearing is so vast, and they speak at a particular megahertz that is under the sea. So when they're coming towards these wind projects, they will divert off their path, off their migratory path there, and go further out and away from the noise that they're hearing underneath the water. And this becomes a very big issue, because when the whales are moving out further out to sea, they become more in danger, in threat, not just from passing ships, but from other deep sea creatures that may want to attack them or their babies. And so it is a very big issue, and that's just the whales. And I'll also let you know about the whales. They actually capture carbon from the atmosphere, and they are actually a natural climate change helper, capturing up to 33 tons of carbon in their lifetimes. And they lock most of that away, and they actually, in fact, can lock more carbon away in their bodies than a tree. And that's something that a lot of people do not know. So that's pretty fascinating, hey? Our animals are just incredible. And so these are just the tiny little facts. I mean, they're huge facts, but to me, there's a series of facts about how the wildlife on our earth, our forests, and how it protects us from climate change. So let me go back, and I will talk about the project I've been working on. The Pioneer Burdekin Pumped Hydro Dam is classed as the biggest hydro dam, pumped hydro dam in the world to be built. They have chosen an area that is there's a range that goes 760 meters up from sea level, and then it goes further at the top to about close to 1,000 meters. So we're right up in the sky. So it's a rainforest. It's a beautiful, pristine rainforest. There is a national park there. It is also a cloud forest. And inside this area, it's Mother Nature's kitchen, millions of years old. Underneath that earth, up on that mountain, is an aquifer. And an aquifer takes hundreds or thousands of years to form and go through the soil. And that water in there is pristine. So while there's 51,000 hectares that will be impacted with the footprint, however, that's not as far as it goes, because the waterways that wind through is the Pioneer and Burdekin rivers. And this is a water-fed environment. So to cut off any water anywhere and mess this environment up, you are not just impacting that footprint. It, as you know, water is a moving body, and it travels right throughout the land. And at the Burdekin River at the Youngala site, it travels all the way up and feeds into the Great Barrier Reef. It's one of the most important freshwater sources for the Great Barrier Reef. So that will be cut off. And anybody who lives along that, I think it's 300-kilometre stretch, anybody who lives along there, where that water, where the river, Burdekin River, winds out to, they're going to have their water cut down. And every other wildlife and forests that are in that location, they're going to lose the water as well. And if we go the other way back towards Mackay, all of that water is going to be cut out. Now, when I first started this project, I won't call it a project, it's an very serious environmental report. I started it because the community had nobody. You know, people would say they would help and come in, and then they would disappear, never be heard of again. So this information got to me, and I said, yes, okay, I'll do it. And, so let me tell you what I found in the aspect of why the community couldn't get any help. So I began, firstly, trying to get in contact with a few organisations to tell me about what species are in the area, give me their data, you know, all of this. Now, one of the creatures up there is the platypus. And I was told seriously by a organisation that they only knew of about 6 platypus up there. Well, 9 months later, I can tell you there's about 2,000 plus up there. And I've had to go on walking through the forests in the weeds style. I'm not doing desktop studies. This is where a lot of these projects are falling apart, because they're going from a desktop study. That means that they have engaged the ANU, the Australian National University, to find sites that, you know, give specifications like where are they going to put their wind projects, where are they going to put their solar projects, and they give them specific dimensions, and the same with the pumped hydro, what they wanted in their dimensions. ANU looked at it and said, okay, we've got a number of different areas here, and, you know, this is the place that you should do it. However, that ANU report then said, number 1, you do your desktop study. Number 2, you do your environmental assessment. Number 3, you do your risk assessment. And number 4, you do your community engagement. Have a guess what happened. They went desktop study and start drilling, start doing their feasibility tests. On the 27th of September 2022, the community woke up to being told that they're going to lose their homes and they better sell up right now. And then they were going to lose the environment. And so we've got desktop studies that are not being followed by what the ANU put a guideline out, that after the desktop studies, you do these 3 things before you do anything. Now, this should cover across the board for every renewable project. So we have no environmental studies done. That is where I come in. And like I said, I was told there were 6 platypus. Now, I'll tell you the reason why many of these government people think the way that they do. For instance, in Queensland, the database called WildNet, that is used for much infrastructure. You know, they survey on a desktop, on databases. They don't do the groundwork. And what they've found is they're 10 million data entries behind because they employ 2 people part-time twice a week. So there's 10 million data entries behind. That applies to New South Wales as well. Your databases are also behind, as is the federal database from the EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation. That's called the SPRAT database. That's behind. Now, the Auditor General in February 2023 turned around and said in regard to Queensland that the database is basically so far behind that no responsible decision for infrastructure could be made without impacting the environment heavily, without knowing what you're going to do to the environment and to the wildlife. So therefore, we have got projects that are going ahead that have not had environmental impact assessments, like the whales. I mean, I read the scientists that said, you know, as long as the whales stay away 100 meters, they'll be fine. You know what? The whales are not going to be staying away 100 meters. They'll be going 1,000 kilometers away because of their hearing, their sensitivity. And we're probably going to see the deaths of many of those whales and their calves because of that. So these sort of things must be brought to the attention of I'll get onto their environmental impacts assessments that they are apparently doing, which are very dodgy. The surveys that they're doing is dodgy. For instance, the rainforest area that I'm working in is of incredibly high biodiversity. It's extreme. It's the highest level of extreme biodiversity. Now, when you've got that kind of environment, to actually get an accurate picture of what is living in that area, both plants and animals, you need to do at least a 10-year survey. That is the correct thing to do for a high biodiversity area in a pristine environment like that. There are mid-level environments, and they require a 4-year survey. So what that entails is like you want 4 seasons of the year, 4 times for 4 years. So this is, and that will only give you an idea of what is coming in over those seasons, because we sometimes have like El Nino, and it comes in sometimes at an 8-year mark, sometimes sooner. And we don't know what species are being impacted in those particular times. Plus, we have fires. And if we keep on allowing these infrastructure renewables to go ahead, clearing all the land, we're going to have a lot worse fire. We must get this addressed. We can't let it go on. How do we stop it? That's the question, isn't it? We seem to have a bunch of clowns in our politicians, and I have listened to them trying to find out how much they know about the environment, and they simply don't. They begin starting to talk about the environment, and then they suddenly divert off into costs and funding and jobs and all this kind of stuff. And I bring them back and I say, no, tell me about the relevance of the platypus. Tell me about the relevance of an eel. You know, all this. They don't have a clue. And you would think that they had people in positions of, in various departments that could actually explain these things to them. Now, I'll let you in on a secret. I used to work in one of those departments, and I was there watching everybody else working. I was doing my best to, do the environmental impact assessments. And I got called into the office one day by my boss, and he said, "Who do you think you are, Sybelle? Who do you think you are?" And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm Sybelle Foxcroft." And he said, "How dare you put this in front of me?" And it was my assessment on the environmental impact assessment. And basically what it came down to was this project was going to go ahead, and I had to make it go ahead. And I was sitting there trying to save koalas because that's my job. But this is what's happening. Now, how I got around that is I then went ahead and held them up for about 14 years, because in order to save those koalas, we had to go and plant new trees and, liaise with stakeholders and all of this kind of thing. Now, whether they went ahead and did that, I don't know, because I left. It was a terrible, toxic environment. So this is the kind of departments, and this is what is happening in the background for, who is approving these projects. When you've got yes people who want to crawl up to the government and say, yes, we'll do it. Yes, we'll do it. And they don't even know what is in the environment, then we're in trouble. And that has been going on for too long. Australia holds the record of the highest extinction of mammals in the world, and we continue to hold that. Now, can you imagine when you compare that to the Amazon and the destruction of the Amazon, the destruction of what China has done to its own country? All these species have been lost, but Australia holds the record of the most extinctions. Now, that is disgusting. The government needs to understand how the environment works, how the wildlife works, and how they help protect us from climate change. Putting these ill-located renewable energies in whale sanctuaries, up in rainforests, in core and critical habitat all across Australia, and at the same time forcing people out of their homes, pressurizing them until they sell their homes to the government. This is wrong. This is not science. This is a lack of education, a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding how the environment works. And what is our precious natural resources like water, and they want to sell it off by the gigaliters to other countries. We've got foreign investors in here. How did it get to this point in Australia? It is one of the most shocking things from an environmental perspective that we have ever seen. If any of these continue to go ahead, let's just say that 80% of them go ahead, then we'll still be looking at the most catastrophic environmental event of destruction in our recent history. All of Australia needs to be protected. We've spent too many years land clearing, poisoning waterways, hacking into core and critical habitat. There are other places to build these things that can still go ahead, but not in these areas that they've got right now. And I cannot understand how the government has come to the decision of these locations. I don't think anybody here does. So we've got a huge lack of transparency going on all renewable energy sites. We don't have to put up with that. Start asking questions, start demanding the answers. Right now, what I do is, because the only way I can deal with the Queensland Hydro, who are the ones that are making the working on the pumped hydro in Western Mackay, is to catch them out all the time, because they are very arrogant and they also don't know their job. So we've caught them out on water pollution, noise pollution. They're just, why I've been up there again just now urgently is because this foreign caterpillar that Queensland Museum, Biosecurity, Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and entomologists cannot identify. It suddenly just arrived. And when you see things like that arrive, how did they arrive? What's changed in the area? And these particular caterpillar have devastated people's properties. So that's why I've been up there. And so we're looking into that. How did they get up there? What has changed in that area? Well, there's one big glaring change. There's a whole bunch of trucks coming in and out. And so, yeah, I publicised the fact about the caterpillar, and it's incredibly aggressive, and it actually went through about 6-7 properties. And I'm talking big properties. They're not like a suburban house. They're huge properties. And then into the national park of this pristine area. So you got to catch them out. You got to keep your eye on every single thing that they're doing. And I know that's very hard, but when they are not accountable to anybody, we have to hold them accountable. So hence after the caterpillar got out, they suddenly started using the wash point where their trucks are supposed to have been washed all the time. So there's a good chance that somebody drove it up there from another area, and still we haven't got the identity of it. So I'm just having a look at my points here. All right, so I think that's all I can really tell you right now, and just feel free to ask me questions later on. But look, thanks so much. And the environment is an incredibly complex issue, and but we must hold them accountable for every law they break, for every animal that is hurt. When you are pre-warned about wildlife being in an area or that's critical habitat, and if those animals end up getting hurt, they don't listen to you. Well, then that's a issue for the RSPCA under the Animal Cruelty Act, and they can be fined about, I think it's $390,000 per animal. And then if you go under the Nature Conservation Act, the deliberate cruelty to, or the deliberate killing of wildlife, that's another $430,000, I think. And both of those also have jail time. So these are things that that you can do, but the lack of knowledge and education that is coming out of these politicians, selling it. Let me tell you this: you do not cut down the world's natural cooling systems and sell it for climate change. That's just wrong. All right, thank you, and I'll talk to you afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sybelle. You can hear Sybelle's passion. So our next speaker is Grant Piper. Grant is a 5th-generation farmer. He runs a beef cattle breeding operation using holistic rotational grazing principles when possible. Grant obtained a Bachelor of Aeronautical Engineering from University of New South Wales before joining the RAF and undertaking pilot training. His later career included teaching technicians and working as a forward air controller. In 1998, Grant left the Air Force and moved to the Coolah district, where he purchased land near family. Grant has extensively researched renewable energy and will be discussing the cumulative environmental impacts, viability, supply issues, life cycle of the infrastructure, and who's ultimately going to benefit. Grant and his wife are founding members of the Urabai Tonga Alliance, which was formed to protect preserve and enhance the native habitat and wildlife from the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone. And my understanding that was the first renewable energy zone in the state. And recently Grant became chairman of the fairly newly formed National Rational Energy Network. So thank you, Grant.
G'day. I'd like to thank Kate for inviting us down. She was one of our first supporters when we began the Uabri-Tungi Lane Lines a few years ago now, and it's good to come down and return the favour, so thank you. We've got a bit of a political declaration, I guess. Yeah, I'm not affiliated with any political parties, and I'm quite proud of the fact I think in the last 20 years everyone I has voted for has come last or second last in the electorates in which I lived. So don't rely on me for any hot tips. Alright, so this is a slide that we designed, one of our neighbours designed for Uabri-Tungi Lane Lines, which is the valley where we live, and the village down the end is the town of Uabri. And so we formed an action group to try and protect that valley from 2 wind farms, one of 185 turbines, one of 138 turbines now, and the associated power lines. So we've got a few slides to get through, and they're going to be fairly information dense, but a lot of it's related, and again, just confirms what the previous speakers are saying about the whole technical deficiency of these projects that they're pushing on us. And you've got to ask, why are we doing it? So this is the Central West Orana REZ. The town of Coolah is just up on the, this thing works? Yeah, you can see it. Coolah, just up here. Yeah, is where we live, Dunedoo, and then the whole area extends north almost to Coolah and west to Narromine, and south down to Molong. The blue lines are the planned and existing power lines, and the red one, you'll see in the next slide up to the northwest, is only in early planning stages. There's very few projects at this stage up in that northwest area of the REZ. As Kate said, we're the lead REZ. The New South Wales government announced 5 REZs, renewable energy zones in New South Wales, back in 2020, and they did it under the Electrical Infrastructure Act 2020, which went through New South Wales Parliament in 17 days in November 2020. And I don't know what you were doing in November 2020, but it probably wasn't reading or following the legislation too closely. So that was the start of the poor consultation. This is from the Energy Code, Energy Corporation of New South Wales. We did have a power line project out in this area being done by Transgrid, and they watched it up to such an extent we managed to get them sacked, and then the state government stood up Energy Code to take it up. And these are the projects that are listed at the moment for the REZ. The hashed-in areas were done earlier projects, wind projects. The 2 large ones in the northeast is up where we are. We're sandwiched between those two. You see the town of Coolah there. The little circles with the eye on the map, the live map, you can click on those and you get the details of those projects. But they don't map them out and show the area they cover. They're just meant to put in a little icon there. Being briefed. So the Central West Orana REZ, at the moment there's 54 projects totalling 14.7 gigawatt, but it's only approved for 4.5 gigawatt, and initially it was gazetted at 3 gigawatt. So they're planning to overbuild massively within that REZ at the moment if these projects go ahead, and this is really only the beginning. We're expecting it to go to 6 gigawatt, and we have seen notes from New South Wales government websites elsewhere that they want to go to 20 gigawatt installed. So the current scope of the projects will be dwarfed by the final development stage in 20 or 30 years' time. We've also got the 500 kilovolt and 330 kilovolt transmission lines, and they're the sort of lines across the highway to the north of here when you drive to Newcastle going to Araring or the Bales Point Power Station. The tall, skinnier lines that look like the 500 kilovolt lines, and the shorter squat lines across the highway are the 330 kilovolt lines. There's also 2 large substations, and even though they've declared REZs, there's lots of projects going ahead or being approved outside the REZs as well. So you're not safe if you're outside the REZ either. I don't know who made this slide up. And your wind. We've so far got 12 wind projects, which total 1,024 turbines. 4 1,400 kilometres squared, given their average footprint, and that's roughly 140 hectares per turbine within the turbine project areas. What upsets people about turbines, what do you know about turbines? It's the visual is the first thing people talk about. The audible noise, infrasound, this delay, we'll talk about that later, in the blades, the epoxy that erode over time and spreads over the land. How do you dispose of them? We've all seen the pictures of them being buried, and at the moment that's about it, they're landfill. There's no way of really recycling them, and the cost of decommissioning them is expected to soak up all the income the property owner may have got during the life of those turbines. And as many people have pointed out, everything they're wanting to build now will be have to be replaced before we get to net zero 2050. I mean, the stuff they're building now will be obsolete and defunct by 2050. It'll all have to be done again before then at more expense. AMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator's own data from 2022 in Australia showed that turbines only delivered 30% of their nameplate capacity most of the time, or all for that year. So they're very inefficient at producing power. Because their life is 25 years, maybe shorter. We had a meeting at Energy Co a week and a half ago, and one of the guys there said that the Dangra wind farm near Wellington, which only started operating in 2019, they're already replacing the head of the turbine, the generator, on some of them. Then you've got the roads, construction pads, the whole footprint during construction, and the roads they want to put in 10 metres wide, certain grade, so there's massive erosion and a massive disturbance of the soil and the farm operations during construction. You've got the birds and bat kills, which are well documented as well. And then you've got the aviation and firefighting, which I've presented on a number of times because it's sort of my core knowledge. And you won't be able to fly aerial tankers anywhere near these things or do any aerial agriculture really. If you're forced to fly above them to drop on fires, it'll be pretty ineffective. So it's going to rule out that option, which is the main option now, and force us to go back to fighting on the ground again. And the rural fire services people like me is mostly the farmers and others around the district. So even if we don't want the turbines, we'll probably end up having to fight without aerial support within turbine areas, or wait for it to come out of the turbine areas onto our own land. And the proponents don't offer any support for that. They're not going to man any fire teams or anyone to come and stay in those areas at this stage. But we'd like to see that if they go ahead. Similar to the previous slide, bigger than you think. They are huge. This is a typical turbine, the Vestas 6.2162, which was shortlisted for the ACEN project in our area, Denmark. There's 260 litres of hydraulic oil, 300 litres of lubricating oil. They've got an oil heater in them because when the wind starts blowing, they need to be warmed up, ready to go. They can't wait for the oil to warm up, so they keep that going the whole time. They also have, they need to be powered to align them to the wind and to get them starting and unfurl the blades. So they consume power even when they're sitting there, and they consume power all the time to keep the oil there warm. 335 tonne in the steel tower. This is for a 250 litre turbine. You've also got a water and glycol mix cooling system, a bit like your car, to keep the oil cool. Each pad, I've got a picture soon, I've heard various numbers, but for these large ones it's about 1,000 cubic metres of concrete, which adds up to about 2,200 tonne of concrete in each base. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, you're the project manager. And the base will never be removed. They're just saying they'll just cut the tower off, do whatever they do with that, and push 30 centimetres of topsoil back over the concrete and leave it there as if that's good enough. There's a base being built. Plus you've got the Rio, but we've got to do this to save the climate apparently. This is all environmentally sound stuff. And yeah, our local guru drew this up, and he, this is to scale. This is down the main street, or not the main street, but next to the main street of the town of Dunedoo down the road, and they're proposing the Orana wind farm around there. And this is a 250 metre turbine next to the silo on the railway in the centre of town, drawn to scale. So that's the sort of thing you're looking at. It's mind-boggling. This is my BPA. It's used in many plastics and epoxy resin. It's an endocrine disruptor, possibly carcinogenic. Obviously, young and unborn are more vulnerable. The EU's food safety reduced limits from 4 micrograms per kilogram body weight a day to 0.04 nanograms, 100,000 times less, not so long ago. So they've recognised it's a problem. You don't need me, Matt. It's okay, you've got the important stuff. And again, this is just something that no one talks about. Officially, and in the environmental impact statements and everything that they do in their documentation to get these things approved, they just don't even talk about this stuff. It's not even flagged. A bit like infrasound. So everything that should stop these things in the tracks, they just ignore. And then these blades erode over the life of the turbines, and you couldn't think of a better way to distribute BPA over the environment, into the waterways, onto the land. What's that do to the animal health and fertility, and human health and fertility? And as a farmer and in livestock, obviously fertility is very important, or you don't have business. The solar, I'm not sure over the top of all that, but so far there's 29 solar projects, which is 9 million panels plus, and roughly 850 megawatt takes 25 square kilometres of area for that installed capacity. So again, they take up a huge area. Problems with solar is the heat island, just the reflection, a bit like the heat island effect in cities. The toxic materials leaching into the soil, and especially if there's a fire or a grass fire that goes through the district. The land's out of production. I know you've seen photos of the sheep grazing under them. We've heard from our knowledge it's nothing, there's full of problems. I mean, they chew the cables, they've got to be excluded, and then the landowner has to go back to removing the weeds manually or using chemical sprays to keep the weeds down. So you can't actually produce anything around or under the solar panels. The same AMO report in 2022 showed that solar in Australia only had a 20% dispatch rate. So out of its installed capacity, it only delivers 20% of that, and roughly a 15-year life. So for the life of a normal thermal power station, or by 2050, everything, all these are going to replace 2 to 3 times. There's a picture I took of an ad in the Herald, I think, some months ago. And this is, again, another point not being discussed. I mean, we're not replacing mining, we're not replacing fossil fuels, we're just adding to inefficient consumption of those resources. You couldn't think of a worse, less efficient way to consume resources than to put it all through these inefficient producers of electricity. You'd be better off burning the oil or the coal or the gas directly to make the energy that you need, and doing that as efficiently as you can, not feeding it through these inefficient middlemen. So again, another unmentioned, I think the miners are loving this, and I think the commodity traders are loving this. They don't care whether it works or not, as long as the money goes around. And then the batteries, because of course finally the awareness comes from government that these things need to be firm, the wind stops blowing and the sun sets. So now we're going to back that up with batteries. Now, if the environmental credentials of turbines and solar panels are bad, as soon as you add batteries, it just destroys it completely, because all the extra energy, the embedded energy, minerals and manufacturing of batteries and their even shorter lifespan, it destroys any credentials that so-called renewables have altogether. So even if you're trying to save the planet, I'm sorry, I don't think this is it. This is just hastening the destruction. If you want to talk about costs, yes, we can't afford it. The Central West REZ has 20 BESS storages of various sizes, and it totals 9.3 gigawatt of storage. Like we said, they love it. The pumped hydro, there are a couple of projects in our area, and as Sybelle has pointed out, the local environmental destruction is massive. No one will be happy with that. And in Australia, hydro, we don't have, we're basically flat. The best places have been built. Snowy Mountains was about the only one that's really viable, and we also tend to be dry, if you haven't noticed. So pumped hydro or hydro in Australia is very limited, very expensive, and it's a really hard way to get any useful power. And again, it doesn't give a good return environmentally, economically, or technically. We've got the transmission lines, and lots of communities are fighting those, even if you're not in the REZ, and even if you're not directly affected by wind or solar. But we have, in the big farming areas, we're not so much, we're grazing, where you can't run machinery under them because the machinery is too high. You don't have the clearance for arcing. You've got the EMF effects on humans and livestock, and again, this is another topic that's poorly investigated or willfully ignored, and a lot of local people have done research on this and have looked at the standards, but the proponents, Energy Co and the government just don't want to talk about it. And this is something for the good doctor. We've got a neighbour down the road, and his doctor told him he should stay 600 metres away from high voltage transmission lines. But there's been no clear answer on that as far as I know at this stage. We've been pushing for underground, and the second undergrounding inquiry just reported, but so far they're resisting putting any of this stuff underground. But high voltage DC underground would be an option. It wouldn't affect as many people, would deliver good power from point to point with low losses. But I think the reason they resist it is they can't connect into it along the route anywhere. It's very expensive to break into. So they want above ground transmission lines so that they can then expand wind and solar along the route of those power lines and connect in via substations. Might be getting a bit, everybody's probably seen that, but it's still so apt to our situation. I mean, we're living this at the moment out there. We're under a compulsory acquisition for power lines over a corner of our property, so it's very real. I've already said, it's a very inefficient use of resources. If you go back to your high school physics and the rules of thermodynamics, you know, first rule is you can only get the energy out of a system equal to what you put in, and the second law is you can't even get that. And so the losses in these systems are so great that they'll never recover what's embedded in them, and it's just totally counterproductive to the stated aim. The intermittent supply and mismatch with demand, we always need a backup to it because the sun sets and the wind stops blowing. So even though you've got 1,000 megawatt of wind installed, you're still going to need 1,000 megawatt of generation capacity somewhere, whether it be a coal or a nuclear or a gas plant. Talk about the lifespan and the power lines. This is a US report. The fellow on the top right, I got a screen grab from Professor Michaud's presentations, if anyone's seen those. They're worth looking at on YouTube, you'll find him. The Queensland Minerals Council, I think, put a couple out, but if you just search, you'll find him. He's done some really great research on the resources required to transition to this utopia in the future, and it's basically unachievable. But the usage in the US, as you see down here, is similar to Australia. You know, it's down at 20%. So all this effort and all this money and all this disruption to people, communities and the environment doesn't deliver very much in the end. Another slide, I can't remember where I grabbed this from, but again, the materials used, steel and concrete, to produce power. You couldn't think of a worse thing than wind and solar. We seem to, you know, excel at doing the most absolutely inefficient thing we possibly can. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I don't know politically. I mean, all the ideologies, whether it's liberalism, capitalism, socialism. I'd like to add another one, which I think is the real culprit, and that's stupidism. And that's what we excel at. I think it's largely, it's just a financial churn. That's the only thing this does efficiently, I think, is shovel money around to the right people, and it's not about generating power at all. The national electricity grid, national electricity market, is just a gambling house for the generators these days, much like it's happened to the water market, which happened a few years ago. Now, Senate estimates back in 2015, when they had an inquiry, discovered the subsidies were around $500,000 per turbine per year. Then they changed the way they do that. It was a bit hard to find. We've got a lady that worked there up until about 2018 in Canberra, and she said they were approaching $800,000 or $900,000 a year, depending on the size of the turbine, with the renewable energy certificates and other things. And as the doctor said, you know, we're going to pay for it all in the end, whether it's through our taxes or through our power bill. Which, this is a slide somebody's done a great lot of work in. So this is 1996 back here, and you could follow through the different events that happened. And as we went up, 2006, the price of electricity started accelerating. Gillard carbon tax starts here, zooms up. Abbott rescinded it and it came back a bit. And then they introduced the safeguard mechanism. The safeguard mechanism, what does that mean? That was the scheme where big polluters, as they saw it, had to pay a penalty tax if they exceeded or created so much pollution per year. So the big heavy industry type businesses had to pay an extra surcharge on everything they did, and that was called the safeguard mechanism. And that's where you saw the other jump. And it probably also corresponds to about the time that Fort and Holm shut down, but you know, correlation doesn't mean causation or any of that stuff. And this is the trajectory for where we're going to go from here, unless we can do something sensible. Now, the timeline to do this, look, I've resigned myself to the fact that we're going to be short of power. You know, the lights are going to go out. We're going to have shortages. It's unavoidable at this stage because of the decisions made 20, 30, 40 years ago when we stopped building power stations of any type of work. So whether we change the laws tomorrow and start down the nuclear path, or whether we persist with trying to build so-called renewables, we're going to have a power shortfall, which will mean we'll all be affected in the way we live, and industry will be further shut down in this country. That's just another slide of the Central West Orana REZ group that we formed. And that's the National Rational Energy Network header, and that's our object there. A quick plug: to protect and advance public welfare and the natural environment by opposing Commonwealth, state or territory law or corporate actions that impose counterproductive energy policies and costs on all citizens. So I hope that includes everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. Grant's been going for a couple of years now, haven't you, with what's been going on out in your area? So just in terms of batteries, I don't know if everyone's aware, we have in Lake Munmara the largest battery in the Southern Hemisphere that's just been put in, which is owned by BlackRock, who is the American investment firm with $10 trillion in assets, sits on an investment roundtable with Treasurer Chalmers, and is actually referred to as the fourth arm of the United States government with how powerful they are. So we'll just go on to introduce our last speaker. So we have here Bill Stinson, who is a committee member of, sorry, I've just got to find it. He's a committee member of the National Rational Energy Network with a focus on sharing information with communities affected by renewable energy zones to share experiences and effects of renewable energy in an area covering the east coast of Australia, from northern Queensland to Tasmania across to South Australia. He's based in Sydney and believes that you don't destroy the environment to save the environment. Bill's focus is on renewable projects' effects on the environment of Australia. He believes we are the custodians of the environment, and in the same way that we have a responsibility to preserve our built heritage, we must understand that we also have a responsibility for our environmental heritage, and that we must speak for the creatures that can't speak for themselves.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kate. We'll just show a short video. It's only 2 minutes. But this is produced by Stephen Nowakowski, North Queensland. Up until about 2.5 years ago, he was a member of the Greens Party, and he was a promoter of renewable energy until he saw what happened at the Caban wind project. So I'll just run this short video. This is a teaser for a 90-minute documentary he's producing to get an indication to people what is happening to our environment. Yeah, thank you.
We're losing control of country by this rapid rollout of renewables, and that is something that really terrifies me. It really, really terrifies me that we're losing control of vast amounts of land and just handing it all over without even asking one question to the renewable energy sector. This is such a beautiful place. Koalas, greater gliders, macropods, beautiful, amazing intact forests.
I prefer to have looking at tallest trees and plants and animals. Anything but a wind turbine. These things, horrible things, are just being placed on your country, that you don't want those things there.
We're getting these vast pastoral leases, properties converted to industrial land use. So as a part of the process, the tenure of these properties changes to industrial energy production. So it's one of the biggest land grabs in Australian history.
They are part of the buffer of the wet tropics World Heritage Area. I have seen the proponents call them, perhaps I'm using a little bit of poetic license here, but flogged out cattle properties. Cattle don't graze along the top of those ridges. They barely visit them.
Thank you. Look, so that's just a short indication of what's happening in northern Queensland and also in other parts of Australia. Advance Australia Fair was written and composed by Peter Dobbs McCormick in 1878 and was proclaimed Australia's national anthem on 19th of April 1984. When our national anthem is sung, how many of us think about the meaning of the words we're singing? Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. We just think about that every time we sing that. The natural environment at proposed wind project sites have developed over hundreds of thousands of years. It's the home of some of Australia's unique flora and fauna. We are the custodians of that natural heritage. In the same way we have a responsibility to preserve our built heritage, we must understand that we also have a responsibility for our natural heritage. We must speak for the creatures that can't speak for themselves. The United Nations Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, adopted on 16th November 1972, considers natural heritage as, and remember, we always hear from our politicians about how we have to follow what the United Nations are doing, we have to listen to them, etc. But they don't listen, they don't do what they say they're going to do. Natural heritage as, and this is what it says, natural features consisting of physical and biological formations or groups of such formations which are of outstanding universal value from the aesthetic or scientific point of view. Geological and physiographical formations and precisely delineated areas which can constitute the habitat of threatened species, of animals and plants of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation. Natural sites are precisely delineated natural areas of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science, conservation and natural beauty. And this is the reason why we must preserve these areas. Do we then condemn our nature's gifts at proposed wind project sites to the same fate as one of Tasmania's unique creatures, the thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger, which was driven to extinction because of failure of people to understand it had more right to exist in the natural environment than those who came after it. An example of the estimated bird kill for 60 wind turbines over proposed 20 years of a project's life using two separate studies would be: the first study was by AGL Energy for its Macarthur Wind Farm for the Senate Select Committee on Turbines report in 2015. It found that be 10 birds killed each turbine in a 12-month period. So over the life of that particular project, be 12,236 birds. The second study by an American called Smallwood in 2013, he did a detailed assessment of correction factors based on data from 60 different reports. And what he found, that it was 11 birds per megawatt per year, implying 22 birds per turbine for a 2 megawatt turbine, or 79,254 birds. So that's for 60. So when you get to 600, add another zero onto that, 792,540 birds. So you can see over a period of time with these projects, it's not going to take long to wipe the bird population out. In Victoria, there's one particular city where they've got wind projects down there, and what it's done, it's wiped out the raptors being the hawks, etc., and now they've got a rat plague down there. So these are the sort of things that affect our environment. When we have these wind projects, the carcasses of the dead birds attract feral animals such as foxes, pigs and cats. The surrounding bushland then becomes a killing ground for these feral animals, and the decimation of small mammals, snakes, lizards, frogs and nesting birds becomes inevitable. There's an executive summary from the Global Warming Policy Foundation Report 36, Green Killing Machines. And what I'll do is I'll provide a copy of that to Kate, so that if anybody you want to get a copy of it, then you can just ask them. It's a PDF copy. It succinctly sums up why we shouldn't pursue the rollout of a patchwork quilt of environmentally destructive, toxic, unreliable, unaffordable wind, solar and batteries connected by a web of high voltage transmission lines threatening Australia's food production capability. What Andrew said was, and he's based in England, renewable energy has developed itself a reputation as being environmentally friendly. This report will show that this reputation is entirely undeserved. Far from improving the world around us, wind, solar, biomass and even hydropower can be highly damaging. A renewables revolution on the scale envisaged by global warming activists will see our landscapes desecrated, our fields industrialised or turned to monocultures and our wildlife slaughtered. Far from making the world a better place, renewable energy will destroy all we hold dear. Is this what environmentalism has come to mean? Then under the Federal Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999, it includes in its description of ecologically sustainable development, the principle of intergenerational equity, that the present generation, and that's us, should ensure that the health, diversity and productivity of the environment is maintained or enhanced for the benefit of our future generations. That's our children, our grandchildren, etc. The farming and grazing sector of our community is continuing to be faced with unintended consequences as a result of the renewable energy industrialisation of the Australian countryside. And politicians, unfortunately, are deceptive. Recently, the New South Wales Parliament passed the New South Wales Climate Change Net Zero Act, which purportedly replicated sections of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Now, we note the difference. In that act, they put New South Wales Climate Change Net Zero Act. The purpose of this act is to give effect to the international commitment established through the 2015 Paris Agreement. Yeah, that's all good stuff. And part of that was to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. So, we say, okay, that's all positive stuff as far as they're concerned. But the 2015 Paris Agreement, Article 2B, says, increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. So they've conveniently left that out. So our farmers and graziers aren't covered by this legislation. They say on the one hand they want to make sure the Paris Agreement is adhered to, on the other hand they leave out something that's going to protect people like Grant and other people in the country. The international commitment in the Act has failed to include the whole international commitment clause, which would protect our farming and grazing communities, together with their prime agriculture and grazing land from the renewable energy industrialisation of rural Australia. This demonstrates the contempt the New South Wales Parliament has for hard-working farmers, graziers, regional and country communities who just want to get on with their lives and produce high-quality food for the nation. Currently, they are confronted with an onslaught of approved applications for an environmentally destructive patchwork quilt of wind, solar, etc. When determining any planning application, primary consideration should be given to the principles of ecologically sustainable development, as I said before, the principle of intergenerational equity. The continuing destruction of the Australian countryside is unacceptable to Australian citizens who support farmers, graziers and regional Australians in their campaign against the irrational development of wind projects and solar projects which are environmentally destructive. Now, as Grant has shown with that graph, energy prices will continue to rise because this particular type of energy generation system is ineffective. So basically what we have is we have two energy generation systems. One, wind, solar, batteries that are intermittent, unreliable, and have to be backed up with another form of generation to make them viable. They have batteries. Well, the other system is we can have our ultra-supercritical coal-fired power stations, which virtually produce very little carbon dioxide, or nuclear, which produces no carbon dioxide. So if we think carbon dioxide is a problem, then that problem can be overcome. You can have a reliable, affordable, available system of electricity, which serves a first world country, first world nation, as opposed to something else, as Grant said, is very resource intensive, got to be replaced in 15 or 20 years, and then gets the issue, energy security is national security. So where do we get our solar panels from? Where do we get our wind turbines from? China. So we're going out there, we want to get nuclear submarines to protect us against a potential enemy, but that potential enemy is going to provide us with solar panels and wind turbines. So the issue then becomes, they don't have to fire a shot. They can just close us down economically. Now, in Xi Jinping's office in Beijing, there's a sign on the wall with Australia. And underneath it, there's a big switch. And all he has to do is pull the switch and all the lights go out. So the point I make is that not only do we have to protect the environment, we also have to look at our security and we look at the cost. And the people we've got in charge at the moment have got no idea. I should have made a declaration at the start. I am a member of the Liberal Party, but I'm one of those people inside the party who wants to change things because there are too many in the party who are pushing this renewable barrow, but there are many of us in there, and the reason we're there is we want to be inside the tent to change things so we can make it better for the Australian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our four speakers today. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the amount of time and energy it takes to research things properly. Thank you for the audience for coming along and having input, and we'll see you next time.